The dark psychology of power. The most dangerous person in any room isn't the one screaming for attention, it's the one quietly calculating how to get it. While good people hesitate, question themselves, and consider others, the worst among us are already 3 steps ahead, climbing over anyone in their path. Today we're exposing the dark psychology behind why psychopaths, narcissists, and manipulators don't just succeed, they dominate. Think about every toxic boss you've ever had, every corrupt politician you've witnessed, every manipulative leader who somehow keeps rising despite leaving destruction in their wake. There's a pattern here that most people refuse to acknowledge. Our systems aren't broken. They're working exactly as designed, rewarding the very traits that make someone dangerous to follow. The uncomfortable truth is that while ethical people are busy doing the right thing, unethical people are busy doing the effective thing. What you're about to discover will fundamentally change how you see power, success, and the people who wield both. We're diving deep into the psychological mechanisms that not only allow the worst leaders to rise, but actually give them a competitive advantage over decent human beings. By the end of this video, you'll understand why being good might be the biggest career mistake you're making and what that means for all of us.
The message that follows is not for the weak.
Why your brain follows toxic leaders. Let's start with something that will make you uncomfortable. The human brain is wired to follow strength, not morality. When our ancestors lived in tribes, the leader who could make quick, ruthless decisions was the one who kept everyone alive. The leader who hesitated, who considered everyone's feelings, who tried to be fair, they got their entire group killed. This ancient programming still runs in our subconscious today, which is why we instinctively respect confidence over competence, decisiveness over deliberation. Here's where it gets disturbing. Psychopaths and narcissists naturally exhibit the exact traits our primitive brains interpret as leadership material. They're confident without self-doubt, decisive without hesitation, and charming without genuine empathy getting in their way. While a normal person thinks, "What if I'm wrong?" or "How will this affect others?" a psychopath thinks, "How do I win?" This mental clarity gives them an enormous advantage in competitive environments. Consider this psychological reality. When you put a room full of people together and ask them to choose a leader, they won't pick the most qualified person. They'll pick the person who acts most like their unconscious idea of what a leader should be. That person is usually the one speaking loudest, taking up the most space, and showing zero vulnerability. These are textbook narcissistic behaviors, but they trigger our deepest evolutionary responses to authority. The most chilling part: good people actually enable this process. Ethical individuals tend to be self-reflective, which means they question their own abilities and defer to those who seem more certain. They avoid conflict, which means they don't challenge obvious bad behavior. They give others the benefit of the doubt, which means they rationalize red flags until it's too late. Every virtue that makes someone a decent human being becomes a liability in the game of power. The corporate psychopath advantage. The corporate world has become a perfect breeding ground for what psychologists call successful psychopaths. These aren't the serial killers you see in movies. They're the CEOs, politicians, and executives who destroy lives with spreadsheets instead of weapons. Studies show that psychopaths are 4 times more likely to be found in leadership positions than in the general population. They thrive in environments where results matter more than methods, where quarterly profits trump human costs. Here's the mechanism that makes this possible. Our economic systems reward short-term thinking and punish long-term responsibility. A psychopathic leader can slash jobs, cut corners on safety, and manipulate numbers to boost immediate performance. By the time the consequences hit, employee burnout, safety disasters, ethical scandals, they've already moved on to their next position with a golden parachute. The system literally rewards the exact behavior that destroys organizations from within. The selection process itself is rigged in their favor. Job interviews, performance reviews, and promotion decisions are all based on self-presentation skills, exactly what narcissists and psychopaths excel at. They know how to mirror what interviewers want to hear, how to take credit for others' work, and how to deflect blame when things go wrong. Meanwhile, genuinely competent people are often overlooked because they don't know how to sell themselves, or they're too honest about their limitations. What's even more insidious is how these leaders create cultures that normalize their behavior. They promote people who think like them, punish those who question their methods, and gradually transform entire organizations into environments where manipulation becomes standard operating procedure. Employees learn that to survive, they must either become complicit or become victims. This creates a self-perpetuating cycle where toxic leadership breeds more toxic leadership. The most dangerous aspect of this phenomenon is how it spreads beyond individual organizations. When psychopathic leaders control major corporations, they influence government policy, shape social norms, and determine the direction of entire industries. Their decisions affect millions of people who never chose to follow them, creating a ripple effect of dysfunction that touches every level of society. We're not just talking about bad bosses. We're talking about a systematic corruption of power itself. Machiavelli's brutal truth about leadership. Niccolo Machiavelli understood this dark truth 5 centuries ago when he wrote that it is better to be feared than loved. He wasn't advocating for cruelty, he was describing the brutal reality of how power actually works. Machiavelli observed that leaders who prioritize being liked over being effective inevitably lose both respect and control. The Prince wasn't a manual for evil. It was an unflinching analysis of why good intentions fail in the face of ruthless ambition. His insights remain disturbingly accurate because human nature hasn't evolved past these primitive power dynamics. Friedrich Nietzsche took this analysis even further with his concept of the will to power, the fundamental drive that motivates all human behavior. Nietzsche argued that traditional morality is often a tool used by the weak to constrain the strong, creating what he called slave morality. While this sounds harsh, consider how often we see genuinely capable people held back by their own ethical constraints, while less scrupulous individuals advance by ignoring those same moral boundaries. Nietzsche wasn't celebrating this reality. He was warning us about the consequences of denying it. Modern psychology has validated these philosophical insights through decades of research on what's called the dark triad: narcissism, Machiavellianism, and psychopathy. People who score high on these traits consistently outperform others in competitive environments, not because they're more capable, but because they're willing to use strategies that ethical people won't consider. They lie without guilt, manipulate without remorse, and exploit others without hesitation. In a system that rewards results over methods, these become superpowers. The psychological concept of moral disengagement, developed by Albert Bandura, explains how otherwise normal people can participate in harmful systems. Through mechanisms like euphemistic labeling, advantageous comparison, and displacement of responsibility, individuals convince themselves that unethical behavior is justified. This is how entire organizations become complicit in toxic leadership. People gradually adjust their moral standards to match the behavior they see rewarded around them. Perhaps most disturbing is the research on system justification theory, which shows that people have a psychological need to defend and rationalize the status quo, even when it works against their own interests. This means that the very people being harmed by toxic leaders often become their strongest defenders, creating cognitive dissonance that prevents them from recognizing the manipulation. We literally program ourselves to accept bad leadership because acknowledging the alternative, that our systems are fundamentally broken, is too psychologically threatening to process. The hidden signals of manipulation. But here's what the research doesn't tell you, and what most people never realize. There's a specific moment in every toxic leader's rise where they make a calculated decision that changes everything. It's not the obvious moments of manipulation or the dramatic power grabs. It's a subtle psychological shift that happens when they realize other people's emotions can be weaponized. Once they cross this line, they stop seeing colleagues as humans and start seeing them as resources to be optimized. The question is, can you recognize this moment when it happens around you? There's a hidden pattern in how these leaders select their victims that will shock you. They don't target the weakest people in the organization. They target the strongest. Specifically, they identify individuals with high competence but low political awareness, people who are so focused on doing good work that they don't see the manipulation happening around them. These become their most valuable assets because they produce results while remaining blind to how they're being used. Are you one of these people without knowing it? The most chilling discovery from recent psychological studies is something called empathy hijacking. Toxic leaders don't lack empathy. They have too much of it, but they use it as a weapon instead of a virtue. They can read your emotions, understand your motivations, and predict your reactions with frightening accuracy. Then they use this information to push exactly the right buttons to get what they want. The scariest part: the better person you are, the easier you are to manipulate using your own values against you. There's a secret language that psychopathic leaders use to communicate with each other, and once you learn to recognize it, you'll start hearing it everywhere. It's not what they say, it's how they say it. Specific phrases, particular timing, certain non-verbal cues that signal to other manipulators that they're in the club. This underground network of toxic individuals often supports each other's rise to power, creating an invisible conspiracy that operates in plain sight. The question is, how many of these signals have you missed? But here's the twist that changes everything. There's emerging evidence that some of the most effective leaders in history may have been what psychologists call adaptive psychopaths. Individuals who possess the ruthless decision-making abilities of psychopaths, but channel them toward genuinely beneficial outcomes. This raises a disturbing question. In a world where nice guys finish last, is developing some psychopathic traits actually necessary for creating positive change? And if so, where exactly is the line between necessary ruthlessness and dangerous manipulation? How toxic leaders rewire your brain. The psychological damage caused by toxic leadership extends far beyond the workplace. It rewires your brain at a neurological level. When you're constantly exposed to manipulation, gaslighting, and psychological abuse, your amygdala becomes hyperactive while your prefrontal cortex shuts down. This means you lose the ability to think rationally while becoming hypersensitive to threat. Victims of toxic leadership often develop symptoms identical to PTSD, including hypervigilance, emotional numbing, and an inability to trust their own judgment. The worst part: these changes can persist for years after escaping the toxic environment. There's a phenomenon called learned helplessness that toxic leaders deliberately cultivate in their followers. By creating unpredictable reward and punishment systems, they train people to stop trying to control their own outcomes. Employees learn that success and failure seem random, that hard work doesn't guarantee recognition, and that speaking up often makes things worse. This psychological conditioning creates a workforce of people who have given up their agency, making them easier to control and exploit. Once this mindset takes hold, it spreads to other areas of life, affecting relationships, health, and personal goals. The most insidious aspect is how toxic leadership creates what psychologists call trauma bonding. When someone alternates between abuse and kindness, their victims develop an addictive attachment to the rare moments of approval. This is why employees often defend leaders who treat them terribly. Their brains have been conditioned to crave validation from the very person who's harming them. The intermittent reinforcement schedule used by toxic leaders is the same technique that makes gambling addictive, and it's equally difficult to break free from. Children who grow up witnessing toxic leadership, whether in their families, schools, or communities, internalize these patterns as normal. They learn that power means domination, that relationships are transactional, and that vulnerability is weakness. This creates a generational cycle where victims of toxic leadership often become toxic leaders themselves, not because they're evil, but because it's the only model of authority they've ever known. The psychological imprinting that happens during formative years shapes how they'll interact with power for the rest of their lives. Perhaps most disturbing is the research on moral injury, the psychological damage that occurs when good people are forced to participate in systems that violate their values. Unlike trauma, which happens to you, moral injury happens when you're complicit in harm. Employees who watch toxic leaders destroy colleagues, who participate in unethical practices to keep their jobs, or who stay silent while witnessing abuse often suffer from a deep sense of shame and self-betrayal. This internal conflict can lead to depression, anxiety, and a fundamental loss of identity that's incredibly difficult to heal. Breaking the cycle of power corruption. So where does this leave us? The uncomfortable truth is that recognizing these patterns doesn't automatically protect you from them, but it's the first step toward building immunity. The worst leaders rise to the top because our systems reward the wrong behaviors. Our psychology is vulnerable to manipulation, and good people often enable the process through their own virtues. But here's what gives me hope. Awareness is spreading. More people are learning to recognize toxic leadership. Organizations are beginning to value emotional intelligence alongside results, and a new generation is refusing to accept that's just how business works as an excuse for psychological abuse. The real question isn't whether you'll encounter toxic leadership in your life. You will. The question is whether you'll recognize it when it happens, whether you'll have the tools to protect yourself and others, and whether you'll choose to be part of the solution or part of the problem. Every time you refuse to normalize toxic behavior, every time you support ethical leadership, every time you choose long-term integrity over short-term advantage, you're helping to change the system that allows the worst among us to rise to the top. Remember this. The same psychological insights that toxic leaders use to manipulate can be used by ethical people to inspire, motivate, and create positive change. The difference isn't in the tools, it's in the intention behind them. Understanding power doesn't make you corrupt. It makes you capable of wielding it responsibly. The future belongs to those who can combine the strategic thinking of a Machiavelli with the moral compass of a Gandhi. The question is, which side of history will you choose to be on? There you have it. The complete script is now finished. This structure provides maximum retention through psychological insights, philosophical authority, curiosity gaps, and a powerful conclusion that empowers the viewer while maintaining the dark, analytical tone throughout.